Hello and welcome to part 2 of our story, Two Sugar Islanders Catch Karelian Fever. I'm here at the home of Jason McLeod, who's my colleague and collaborator in making these videos. They were his idea in the first place, and now he's the director and the cameraman as well. So we're going to pick up with the story. If you have not seen part 1 of this video, which is also up on YouTube, I really recommend that you look at it first, or else you're going to find this story continuing here to be a bit hard to follow. Recall that as we ended part 1, the Stalinist purges were gaining momentum in the Soviet Union, including Karelia. Near the end of 1937, Lori and Sylvie Hokkanen had been in Karelia about 3.5 years. They made some good friends, had some enjoyable times, but they suffered many hardships. Then they perceived some frightening possibilities emerging. After the change in the work week and the new penalty for showing up late for work, mentioned at the end of part 1, Lori wrote ominously, and I quote, "I was able to avoid the consequences of ever being late to work, but we still felt far from secure. Arrests were happening more and more often, even among people we knew." Late in 1937, a close friend at the factory, a Finnish Canadian named Benny Lane, who had been brought to Karelia as a child, was arrested. His father was also arrested. Neither was ever heard from again. Lori and Sylvie tell of a night in their commune in the summer of 1938 that all the Finns later called Suuri Kauhu. Probably butchered that, but it translates to be the Great Terror. And I quote, "We spent the whole night expecting a knock at our door, but it never came. We watched from the window as gunmen took some of our good friends away." End quote. Imagine what that would be like. 23 men from the machine shop where Lori worked were arrested that night. He never knew why he wasn't arrested as well. Lori said in the book, and I quote, "Most of the people who were taken were never seen or heard from again. Either they perished in the concentration camps, or they received what the Finns called a 5-kopeck sentence, which meant they were shot. 5 kopecks was the cost of a rifle bullet." End quote. And here's a telling statistic from the book, The Search for a Socialist El Dorado, Finnish Immigration to Soviet Karelia from the United States and Canada in the 1930s. Quote, "Although the share of Finns in the population of Karelia in the mid-1930s barely exceeded 3%, more than 40% of all victims of the Stalinist terror in Soviet Karelia were Finns." End quote. In late summer of 1938, Lori and Sylvie decided that they would try to get out and return to the United States. No wonder the Hokkanens wanted out. They faced 2 hurdles. One, would they be allowed into the U.S. since they were no longer U.S. citizens? Recall that they gave up U.S. citizenship in order to become Soviet citizens, which was required for Sylvie to be a teacher there. And secondly, would the Soviet authorities allow them to leave? Not many were able to leave, whether immigrants or Soviet-born. Sylvie traveled to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and was relieved to learn that they would indeed be allowed to return to the U.S. But it was much harder to get permission from the Soviets to leave. Meanwhile, the so-called Winter War began in November of 1939 when Russia attacked Finland. Needless to say, given their location, the Hokkanens weren't far from the war activity in Karelia. The Winter War only lasted 105 days, ending in March of 1940. Finland ceded about 11% of its land to the Soviet Union in the peace agreement. Over a year after they had applied to leave, they finally got permission. They never knew why they got it, with so many having been turned down. The reason they had given to the authorities for leaving was that Laurie's elderly parents needed them. As far as they knew, many years later, when they wrote their book, only one other Finnish-American family was allowed to leave Petrozavodsk. I'll omit several difficulties they faced as they actually made their way home. Because World War II was going on in Europe in late 1940, they had to head east from Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok in late February 1941. There they would catch a boat for Japan. I emphasize that date for two reasons. First, it's in the dead of winter, crossing Siberia. Think of the snow scenes in the movie Dr. Zhivago. And secondly, they were to pass through Japan in March of 1941. Recall that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and things were already getting tense. The train trip across Siberia took 9 days. To make a long and interesting story short, they left Japan on March 29, 1941, and arrived in San Francisco on April 12th, which happened to be Good Friday. Nothing could have been more beautiful to them, I'm sure, than the sight of the Golden Gate Bridge. For many years, they didn't speak much about their experience. It took them over 3 months to clear customs and immigration in California, and 12 years to regain their U.S. citizenship. Their daughter Anita was born about a year after they'd returned. At her urging, almost 5 decades later, Laurie and Sylvie wrote the book Karelian, a Finnish-American couple in Stalin's Russia, 1934 to 1941. I've lent my copy over the years to many friends. In fact, almost forced it on them. I've not lent any other book out nearly as often. I highly recommend it to anyone who's watching this video and is interested in learning more. It went out of print a few years ago, and the Chippewa County Historical Society encouraged a woman named Nyla Middleton, who was the widow of the Hokanen's grandson, to get it republished. The Hokanens themselves and all of their descendants had passed away by then. Nyla did so, and I wrote an afterword, published separately, to accompany their book when we sold it locally. The image on the back cover of my afterword was taken at the Hokanen home on Sugar Island around 1990. Laurie is second from the left, their daughter Anita is fifth from the left, and Sylvie is second from the right. The title to the afterword is from a poem that Sylvie wrote. And here's an image of them taken at a Fin Fest on Sugar Island in 1999. They would both pass away in the next 4 years. We are so lucky to live in this country. Nothing has ever made me feel that so strongly as reading this book. I'm going to mention another book which deals with Karelian fever and also has an Upper Peninsula connection. The book, titled They Took My Father, by Mame Savander, tells the story of her father, Oscar Corrigan's career and the fate he ultimately suffered as a victim of the Stalinist purges in Karelia. He had been editor of the Finnish language newspaper Tuomis, which is a leftist newspaper published for a time in Hancock, Michigan, and later it moved to Superior, Wisconsin. The issue we show here happens to be from April of 1912, when the paper was published in Hancock, and it describes, of all things, the sinking of the Titanic. Oscar persuaded many Finnish Americans to go to Karelia, and he took his family there in 1934, the same year the Hokanens went. Savander's book tells of how, on November 4th, 1937, Oscar Corrigan was arrested in Petrozavodsk. The family never heard from him again. And after decades of not knowing his fate, Mame, who had stayed along with her mother in Petrozavodsk, finally got a death certificate in 1991 stating that her father had been executed on January 8th, 1938, 2 months after being arrested. And what was his crime? Apparently, he was thought to be a subversive Finn, even though a longtime member of the Communist Party. Estimates range from 700,000 to 1.2 million people were killed in the Stalinist purges of 1937 and 38. We show here the cover of Mame Savander's book, followed by the message she wrote in the dedication to the book. I added that black border around her words for obvious reasons. In wrapping this up, here's a small personal tale I was reminded of as I reread the Hokanen's book. They describe the persistent food shortages, waiting for hours in line when word gets out that a store has a fresh stock of some kind of inventory. Many joined the long lines without even knowing what might have become available. Whatever it was, they probably wanted some of it. I'm almost 85 years old. I've rarely known any scarcities. Some of you may remember in the early 1970s when there was a severe beef shortage here. I remember going into Neville's Grocery in the Sioux, which really specialized in meat, and seeing a meat case that was totally empty. What was my first thought? They must be doing a thorough cleaning of the meat case. It didn't even enter my mind that perhaps there was no meat available. That's being spoiled and being lucky to live in a country like ours. With the terribly divisive politics of today, I sure hope we don't screw it up. In closing, I mentioned something that is revealed at the beginning of the Hokanen book. When they returned to Sugar Island and told Lori's mother what horrors they had witnessed and barely escaped, she didn't believe them. Didn't believe her own son. It certainly shows how one can be blinded by an ideological mindset.